A woman did not need to accuse anyone to quietly erase them from the world around her. In the Tudor court, nothing was ever said clearly. Yet everything was understood. A pause, a glance, a question left unfinished. These were enough to begin a shift that no one could trace and no one could stop. Conversations changed before facts appeared, and distance formed before anyone admitted it. No orders were given. No conflict was seen. Yet positions moved. Loyalties softened, and someone slowly disappeared without a single public moment marking the fall. Tonight, you will step into a world where silence spoke louder than truth, and a single whisper could decide who remained and who was quietly forgotten. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If a woman wished to remain safe in the Tudor court, she did not begin by defending herself. She began by controlling how she was seen. Reputation shaped everything long before any truth had the chance to matter. In the crowded halls of power, where nobles gathered under painted ceilings and heavy fabrics, a person's position was rarely secured by wealth alone. It depended on how others spoke of them when they were not present. A name repeated with respect opened doors. A name repeated with hesitation quietly closed them. No one announced these changes directly. They appeared in small ways. A seat offered or withheld. A conversation that ended too quickly. A glance that did not return. These details were easy to ignore in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that could not be easily reversed. For women, this pattern was even more fragile. Every movement was observed, even when no one seemed to be looking. The way a woman stood beside her husband, the way she lowered her eyes in conversation, the way she responded to praise or attention. Each gesture was read as evidence of her character. There was no separation between behavior and judgment. Everything became a sign. Virtue was not private. It was performed. A respectable woman did not simply behave well. She had to be seen behaving well. Repeatedly and consistently. Any break in that image, even a small one, could be remembered and repeated by others. Once repeated, it gained weight. And once it gained weight, it became difficult to remove. This constant observation created a quiet tension that never fully disappeared. Women learned to speak carefully, to move carefully, and sometimes to remain silent altogether. Silence, when used correctly, could suggest restraint. Used poorly, it could suggest guilt. Rumors thrived in this environment. They did not require confirmation. Only attention. A single suggestion, spoken softly, could move further than a direct accusation ever could. It could pass from one person to another, changing each time slightly, until no one remembered its original form. What made rumors powerful was not their accuracy, but their persistence. In a society where reputation held real consequences, people listened closely to anything that might signal danger. They repeated what they heard, not always with intention, but with caution. No one wanted to be the last to know. No one wanted to defend the wrong person. A family's standing could begin to shift without warning. It did not collapse suddenly. It tilted. Conversations around them became guarded. Invitations grew uncertain. The sense of stability they once relied on began to feel less secure, even if nothing had been proven. And still, no one would speak openly about it. That was the nature of the court. Confrontation risked drawing attention. Indirect suggestion allowed things to move quietly, without responsibility. A rumor could exist without an owner, and because of that, it was difficult to stop. For the poorest members of society, Reputation mattered in smaller, more immediate ways. But within the court, it was everything. It determined alliances, influenced marriages, and shaped the future of entire households. To lose, it was not just to be embarrassed, it was to be repositioned, often permanently. This is what made even the smallest whisper dangerous. Not because it was loud, but because it was believable enough to be repeated. And once repeated, it no longer belonged to a single voice. It became part of the environment. A woman who understood this did not need to argue or defend herself constantly. She needed to maintain an image that others would hesitate to question. She needed to appear consistent, controlled, and beyond suspicion. Because in a place where everyone was watching, the absence of doubt was more valuable than the presence of truth. Reputation in the Tudor court was not protected by facts, but by how often it was repeated and how rarely it was questioned. Once people began to listen more closely, even the smallest uncertainty could start to carry weight far beyond its origin. And somewhere within that fragile balance, some understood exactly when to speak and when to let others do it for them. A respectable wife did not need to raise her voice for others to begin adjusting their behavior around her. She remained composed in every space she entered. Whether standing in a crowded hall or seated beside her husband at a long table, her presence followed the same pattern. Her posture stayed upright, her hands still, her voice measured and even. There was nothing dramatic about her, nothing that demanded immediate attention. Yet, over time, people began to notice her precisely because nothing about her changed. Consistency created a quiet form of authority. In a court where emotions could shift quickly and alliances could change without warning, a person who behaved the same way every day became something others relied on. Her calm did not need explanation. It suggested control. It suggested certainty. And in an environment where certainty was rare, that suggestion carried weight. She did not confront, and that was part of her strength. Open conflict created noise. Noise invited attention. Attention led to questions, and questions could expose intentions. A respectable wife understood that it was safer to remain within the boundaries of expected behavior. She did not argue in public. She did not raise accusations. She allowed others to speak more than she did. This restraint made it difficult for her to challenge. There was nothing to oppose directly, no statement to deny, no action to criticize. If anyone attempted to question her, they would find nothing clear enough to hold on to. Her silence protected her, not by hiding something, but by leaving nothing visible to attack. She used her image carefully. Her clothing remained appropriate, never excessive, never careless. Her expressions stayed controlled, never revealing too much emotion. When spoken to, she responded with patience. When observed, she appeared attentive but not intrusive. Each of these details reinforced the same impression that she was proper, stable, and above suspicion. People trusted what looked correct. In a society that valued appearances, virtue did not need to be proven through actions alone. It needed to be seen, repeatedly, in ways that others recognized. A woman who consistently presented herself within these expectations became a reference point. Others compared her behavior to hers, often without realizing it. This comparison shaped perception. If she reacted to something with quiet concern, others began to wonder what required concern. If she chose not to engage in a conversation, others reconsidered their own involvement. Her decisions were subtle, but they influenced how situations were interpreted. Silence played a central role. It was not empty. It created space for others to think, to question, and to speak. When she did not respond immediately, people filled that absence with their own assumptions. They tried to understand what she might be thinking, and in doing so, they often convinced themselves of meanings she had never stated. This made others less cautious. Because she did not accuse, no one felt directly threatened. Because she did not explain, no one felt directly guided. They believed they were acting on their own understanding. That belief made them more willing to repeat what they had heard or to draw conclusions without hesitation. Her influence remained indirect. She did not need to spread information herself. She only needed to create conditions where information would move in a certain direction. A pause in the right moment. A look that lingered slightly longer than expected. A careful change in tonethes were enough to guide attention. Over time, these small signals formed patterns. People began to anticipate her reactions. They watched her more closely, not because she demanded it, but because they had learned that her behavior often aligned with what later became widely accepted. This anticipation increased her influence without requiring her to act more openly. Meanwhile, she remained unchanged. Her routine continued. Her demeanor stayed consistent, even as conversations around her began to shift. She did not adjust her behavior in visible ways. This stability made it difficult to connect her to any changes that occurred. Others, however, were not as stable. A mistress, placed under the same scrutiny, could not rely on the same protection. Her position depended on attention, and attention was unstable. When the atmosphere around her began to change, she felt it immediately. Conversations shortened. Invitations became uncertain. The ease she once experienced disappeared without explanation. She could not confront what she could not define. There were no clear accusations to respond to, no direct hostility to challenge, only a gradual distance that widened with each passing day. The absence of clarity made the situation more difficult, not less. And through all of this, the wife remained untouched, not because nothing was happening, but because nothing could be traced back to her. Her strength did not lie in action, but in how little action was required. She allowed the environment to respond to her presence, and in doing so, she shaped outcomes without appearing to do so. This was not accidental. It required patience, awareness, and a careful understanding of how people observed and interpreted behavior. It required knowing when to remain silent and when to allow others to speak. Most importantly, it required discipline, because once she broke that consistency, even once, the image she had built could begin to weaken. And without that image, her influence would no longer feel natural. So she maintained it, not for a single moment, but continuously. Her power did not come from confrontation, but from the quiet consistency others learned to trust without question. As people began to interpret her silence in their own ways, they unknowingly carried her influence further than she ever needed to. And somewhere within that quiet control, the first real shifts began to take hold before anyone realized they had already begun. Rumors did not need to be written down for them to become accepted as something real. They moved quietly through the Tudor court, carried not by records or declarations, but by memory and repetition. A sentence spoken in passing could remain in someone's mind long enough to be shared again later. Slightly changed, slightly softened, or slightly sharpened, depending on who repeated it. Nothing about them appeared structured. There were no official statements, no names attached to their origin, and no clear moment when they began. One person might recall hearing something in a corridor. Another might remember a similar detail mentioned at a table. These fragments did not match perfectly, but they did not need to. What mattered was that they felt familiar. The more often a rumor was heard, the less it felt like speculation. It began to take on the weight of something already known, even if no one could explain where it came from. People did not ask for proof. They listened for patterns, and once a pattern appeared, it was enough. The difficulty in tracing a rumor gave it a kind of protection. If someone tried to challenge it, there was no single voice to confront. No one claimed responsibility for starting it, and no one could be certain of its original form. This made denial ineffective. To deny something unclear only made it more noticeable. Silence, in contrast, allowed it to continue. A respectable wife understood this without needing to state it directly. She did not need to repeat a story herself. She only needed to allow certain ideas to exist long enough for others to carry them forward. A question asked carefully could do more than a statement. She might wonder aloud if something had been misunderstood, or if a situation appeared different from how it first seemed. She did not provide answers. She left space. That space invited interpretation. Others filled it quickly. People repeated what they believed they had understood. They adjusted details to make the story clearer, even if clarity meant moving further away from what had actually happened. Each repetition added confidence, even when it reduced accuracy. Over time, the rumor became more stable, not because it was verified, but because it was repeated in similar ways by different people. This consistency gave it the appearance of truth. It no longer felt like something uncertain. It felt like something already decided. And still, there was no evidence. Nothing could be pointed to directly. No document existed. No witness could confirm a single version as correct. The rumor remained just beyond reach, present enough to influence behavior, but distant enough to avoid responsibility. This made it particularly effective. A mistress could feel its presence without being able to respond to it. She might notice a change in how she was spoken to or how often she was included in certain gatherings. The shift was gradual, but it was consistent. She could not defend herself against something undefined. There was no accusation to deny, only a growing sense that others were reconsidering her place. The absence of clarity made her position weaker, not stronger. Without something specific to challenge, she had nothing to hold on to. Meanwhile, those around her adjusted quietly. Conversations became more cautious. Certain topics were avoided in her presence. Some individuals chose distance without explanation. None of these actions seemed connected at first, but together they created a new pattern. That pattern did not require explanation. It simply existed, reinforced by repetition and accepted through familiarity. People behaved as if something had already been confirmed. Even though nothing had been proven, the rumor had done its work, not by declaring anything openly, but by shaping how others thought, spoke, and responded. It moved without structure, yet produced clear effects. It existed without evidence, yet influenced decisions. And because it never took a fixed form, it could not be easily removed. It remained in conversation, in hesitation, in the small adjustments people made without realizing why. It became part of the environment, something present even when no one mentioned it directly, a tool without a name, a process without a record. And once it began, it rarely needed guidance to continue. A rumor did not need proof to become powerful, only repetition and the absence of a clear beginning. As it moved from one person to another, it changed just enough to feel convincing while remaining impossible to trace. By the time anyone considered questioning it, the outcome it suggested had already started to take hold. A single sentence, spoken at the right moment. We could begin a shift no one could stop. It did not need to sound certain. It did not need to sound complete. In fact, it worked better when it did not. A remark placed carefully into an ongoing conversation could pass unnoticed at first, blending into the rhythm of polite exchange. Only later would it begin to settle in the minds of those who heard it. Timing made the difference. There were moments in the Tudor court when attention was already unsettled. A husband showing hesitation in public. A mistress receiving too much notice too quickly. A gathering where conversations lingered longer than usual, as if people were waiting for something to be said. In these moments, people listened more closely. They were already searching for meaning, even if they did not admit it. They watched for small signals, for anything that might explain what they felt but could not name. A well-placed whisper did not create suspicion from nothing. It gave shape to something that was already forming. The words themselves remained simple. They might take the form of a question, offered with hesitation. They might suggest concern rather than certainty. There was no need to accuse, because an accusation required proof. Suggestion required only attention. Others did the rest. Once the idea entered the conversation, it did not remain where it was placed. It moved. It passed from one person to another, each time adjusted slightly to fit the speaker's understanding. Some repeated it cautiously, others repeated it with more confidence. The differences did not weaken it. They allowed it to spread. No one paused to confirm it. There was no formal moment where the rumor became accepted. Instead, acceptance happened gradually, through repetition and familiarity. The more often it was heard, the less it felt like something new. It became part of what people already believed. A respectable wife did not need to guide this process openly. She needed only to recognize when the court was ready to listen. Speaking too early would draw attention. Speaking too late would reduce the effect. The moment had to feel natural, as if the idea had appeared on its own. That was what made it effective. It did not interrupt the flow of conversation. It followed it. It did not challenge existing beliefs directly. It adjusted them slightly, just enough to redirect attention. Once redirected, attention rarely returned to where it had been before. The mistress often noticed the result before she understood the cause. A room that once felt open now seemed measured. Words addressed to her became more careful. Some people avoided speaking to her altogether, not out of hostility, but out of uncertainty. Uncertainty was enough. It did not need to be rejected immediately. It only needed to remain present. Over time, that presence influenced behavior. People distanced themselves, not because they were instructed to, but because they sensed that distance was safer. Meanwhile, no accusation had been made. There was no statement to deny, no formal complaint to answer. Everything remained within the boundaries of acceptable conversation. The shift existed, but it could not be pointed to directly. This allowed it to continue, because what could not be named could not be easily stopped. The husband, hearing fragments of these conversations, began to feel the effect as well. He might not understand the full story, but he understood the tone. Something was being suggested, even if no one said it clearly. That suggestion created doubt, and doubt changed behavior faster than any accusation. Once doubt entered, it did not require reinforcement. It repeated itself. Each hesitation confirmed it. Each guarded conversation strengthened it. The absence of clarity made it harder to dismiss. All of this could begin with a single moment. Not a speech, not a confrontation, just a sentence placed where it would be heard and remembered. Nothing more was needed. A quiet suggestion, introduced at the right moment, could reshape how an entire court chose to see a single person. As others repeated what they believed they had understood, the idea moved further than the original voice ever could. Long before anyone thought to question its origin, its consequences were already settling into place. Timing did not need to be precise, but it needed to feel natural enough that no one questioned it. In the Tudor court, moments of stability rarely lasted long. Beneath the surface of formal gatherings and repeated rituals, small changes were always taking place. A hesitation in speech, a delay in response, a glance that lingered slightly too long. These details signaled that something was beginning to shift. A husband's uncertainty was often the first sign. It did not appear as a clear decision. It showed itself in smaller ways. He might pause before responding to his mistress. He might speak more carefully in public. He might begin to listen more than he spoke, as if weighing something he could not yet define. Others noticed this before he did. In a court built on observation, hesitation did not remain private for long. It moved through conversation quietly, without being named directly. People adjusted their tone around him. They watched his reactions more closely. They began to expect that something might change, even if they did not know what. This created a moment of openness. When people sensed uncertainty, they became more receptive to suggestion. They listened differently. They paid attention to details they might have ignored before. A remark that would have passed unnoticed in a stable moment could now carry meaning. At the same time, the court was always searching for something new to discuss. Repetition created boredom, and boredom created curiosity. Conversations turned toward anything that felt slightly unusual, slightly out of place. A small inconsistency could become a subject of interest, not because it was important, but because it offered something different. This made the environment ready. A suggestion introduced at this point did not need to force attention. It met an audience already prepared to receive it. People were not only willing to listen, they were looking for something to notice. The mistress, without realizing it, often provided the final condition. A minor mistake was enough. It did not need to be serious. A response that seemed too confident. A gesture that appeared slightly out of place. Or a moment where she drew too much attention could create a brief discomfort in those observing her. That discomfort did not disappear immediately. It remained quietly, waiting to be explained. People did not always know why something felt wrong, but they recognized the feeling. Once recognized, they began to look for confirmation. This was when timing mattered most. A suggestion placed before the discomfort faded could attach itself to that feeling. It explained, even if it was incomplete. And once an explanation existed, people stopped searching for alternatives. The idea settled quickly. It did not need to be repeated immediately. It only needed to remain present. Others would return to it on their own, especially when similar moments appeared. Each repetition made it feel more certain, even if nothing new had been added. The wife did not need to rush. Acting too early would draw attention. Acting too late would miss the moment when others were most receptive. The balance lay in recognizing when the court was already leaning in a certain direction, and allowing a small push to guide it further. This required patience. It meant observing without intervening, waiting without appearing to wait. The right moment did not announce itself clearly. It revealed itself through small changes in behavior. In tourne. Inattention. Once it arrived, it passed quickly, and once it passed, it could not be recreated in the same way. That was what made it valuable. A well-timed suggestion did not need reinforcement. It aligned with what people were already beginning to believe. Because of that, it felt natural, even inevitable. And when something felt inevitable, it was rarely questioned. The mistress, sensing the shift, often could not identify its source. She might notice that certain looks lasted longer, that certain conversations stopped when she approached. She might feel that something had changed, but she could not name the moment when it began. That moment had already passed, and with it, the chance to prevent what followed. Timing did not create the change, but it allowed it to settle without resistance. As uncertainty, curiosity, and small mistakes aligned, people became ready to accept an explanation they had not fully examined. By the time anyone noticed how these moments connected, the direction of attention had already been quietly decided. The first person who heard a quiet suggestion often mattered more than the words themselves. Not everyone in the Tudor court carried information the same way. Some spoke too openly and were ignored. Some remained too silent and were overlooked. The effectiveness of a rumor depended not only on what was said, but on who received it first. A respectable wife understood this without needing to explain it. She did not choose someone who would repeat her words loudly. She chose someone who would carry them carefully, without appearing to do so. The goal was not speed, but direction. The idea needed to move through the right spaces. Not all spaces at once. A close maid was often the most useful. She moved between rooms without drawing attention. She assisted in private spaces, heard conversations not meant for public ears, and carried small details from one part of the household to another. Her presence was expected, which made her invisible in a way others were not. She did not need to be instructed directly. A simple remark, offered without emphasis, could remain with her long after the conversation ended. She might repeat it casually in another room, not as a statement, but as something she had heard or noticed. Her tone would not sound deliberate, and because of that, it would not invite suspicion. From there, the idea continued to move. A maid spoke to another servant, who passed it to someone else, who eventually mentioned it in a different setting. Each repetition softened the origin. The further it travelled, the less connected it felt to where it began. An older lady of status served a different purpose. She did not move as frequently, but when she spoke, others listened. Her reputation gave weight to even the smallest observation. If she expressed concern, it was taken seriously. If she hesitated before responding, it created uncertainty in those around her. She did not need to repeat the entire idea. Even a partial version, offered with restraint, could reinforce what others had already heard. Her role was not to spread the rumor widely, but to confirm it indirectly. Once confirmed, even in a subtle way, the idea became harder to dismiss. A man loyal to the wife's family added another layer. He did not speak often about private matters, which made his words appear measured when he did. If he mentioned something cautiously, it seemed as though he had considered it carefully. Others assumed there must be a reason behind his hesitation. He did not need to provide details. His uncertainty alone was enough. It suggested that there was something worth questioning, even if it was not fully understood. This kind of suggestion is carried differently. It did not feel like gossip. It felt like concern. Together, these individuals created a path. The idea did not move randomly. It passed through people who shaped how it was received. Each person added a different tone. Casual, concerned, cautious, without changing the core suggestion. This made the rumor feel balanced. It was not repeated in the same way every time. It adapted slightly depending on who carried it. These variations made it seem less constructed and more natural, as if it had formed on its own. The wife remained outside of this path. She did not appear connected to any of these exchanges. Her role was limited to the beginning, and even that beginning was difficult to define. By the time the idea reached its third or fourth repetition, it no longer felt like it belonged to anyone. This distance protected her. If anyone tried to trace the rumor, they would find only fragments, each pointing in a different direction. There was no clear origin, only a series of people who had heard it from someone else. Meanwhile, the effect continued to grow. Those who heard the idea from multiple sources began to trust it more, not because it had been proven, but because it had been repeated by different voices. Each repetition added familiarity, and familiarity reduced doubt. The mistress, observing these changes, could not identify where they began. She might recognize certain faces turning away, certain conversations ending abruptly, certain invitations no longer arriving. The pattern was clear, but the source remained hidden. That was the intention. Because once the first listener was chosen carefully, everything that followed no longer needed to be controlled. The first listener did not simply hear the idea, but determined how it would be carried forward. As it passed through different voices, each added just enough variation to make it feel natural and unplanned. Long before anyone questioned where it began, it had already reached the people who mattered most. A suggestion rarely begins as a statement. It appeared more naturally as a question, placed into conversation with just enough hesitation to feel sincere. In the Tudor court, certainty invited challenge. Question, however, invited thought. They asked others to participate, to consider possibilities without feeling directed. A respectable wife understood the difference. She did not say that something had happened. She wondered if it might have. She allowed a pause to follow, long enough for the listener to begin filling the silence. That silence was not empty. It encouraged interpretation. The question remained simple. It did not contain an accusation. It did not name anyone directly. It referred only to what might be misunderstood or what might require attention. The lack of clarity made it easier to accept. It felt cautious rather than deliberate. Others responded carefully. They did not reject the question outright because there was nothing firm to reject. Instead, they considered it. They repeated it, sometimes changing the wording slightly, sometimes adding a detail they believed they had noticed. Each repetition moved it further from its origin. What began as a question gradually lost its uncertainty. Not all at once, but through small adjustments. Someone might repeat it with less hesitation. Someone else might remove the question entirely and speak as if something had already been observed. This shift happened quietly. No one marked the moment when the suggestion became something more. It simply changed as it moved, becoming easier to repeat and harder to ignore. Concern played an important role. A wife did not appear curious for the sake of curiosity. She appeared concerned for the stability of what surrounded her. Her tone remained controlled, her expression steady, as if she was considering something that affected more than herself. This made her words seem necessary. She did not speak to create conflict. She spoke to prevent it. Or at least, that was how it appeared. By framing her remarks as concern, she avoided the impression of intention. Others listened differently when they believed the motive was protective. This shifted responsibility. The listener did not feel they were receiving gossip. They felt they were being included in something that required attention. This difference changed how they responded. They did not dismiss it. They carried it. The idea spread without resistance. No one felt attacked. No one felt accused. Because of that, no one moved to defend the person at the center of the suggestion. Without opposition, the idea continued to grow. Reference to shared values reinforced it. The wife might speak of reputation, of stability, of what was expected within the court. She did not connect these ideas directly to any individual. She allowed others to make that connection on their own. Once made, it was difficult to undo. People trusted conclusions they believed they had reached independently. Even if those conclusions began with someone else's question, they no longer felt influenced. They felt certain. This created distance around the mistress. Those who had once spoken freely became more careful. They chose their words with greater attention. Some avoided speaking at all. The change did not come from instruction, but from perception. Perception did not require confirmation. It required repetition and acceptance. Once the idea had settled, it influenced behavior without needing to be discussed openly. It remained present in the way people spoke, in the way they looked, in the way they chose to remain silent. The wife remained consistent. She did not return to the same question repeatedly. She did not press for answers. She allowed others to carry the idea forward. Her role was limited to the beginning, where the suggestion first appeared. That limitation protected her, because once the idea moved beyond her, it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the court. A question did not need to provide answers to begin changing how people thought. As concern replaced accusation, others carried the idea further without feeling directed. By the time anyone considered where the thought had first appeared, it no longer felt like it had come from a single voice. A respectable wife protected her position by never allowing herself to be directly connected to what others were beginning to say. She did not mention names. Even when a situation seemed obvious, she avoided attaching any person to her words. She spoke in general terms, referring only to what might affect the household, the family, or the court as a whole. This distance prevented her from appearing personal, and without that connection, Nothing she said could be traced back as an accusation. Names created responsibility. Without names, there was nothing to deny and nothing to defend. Listeners were left to decide for themselves who the suggestion might involve. And once they made that decision, it felt like their own conclusion, not something given to them. This separation was deliberate. It allowed the idea to move freely without being tied to a single source. It also ensured that if the situation changed, she could remain unaffected. Her words could not be used against her. Because they had never been clearly directed at anyone, her expression remained controlled. She did not appear angry, even when others might have expected it. Anger drew attention. It suggested personal involvement, and personal involvement invited scrutiny. Instead, she allowed a quieter emotion to take its place. She appeared concerned, not openly distressed, but gently unsettled. Her tone softened. Her gaze lowered slightly. She allowed a pause to linger before responding, as if considering something she would rather not say. This created the impression that she was affected, but not reactive. That impression mattered. Concern suggested sincerity. It made her words feel less like intention and more like reflection. Others responded differently to the concern. They did not question it as easily. They accepted it as something natural, something appropriate. This shaped how she was perceived. She was not seen as someone creating a problem. She was seen as someone noticing one. That difference allowed her to remain within the boundaries of respectability, while still influencing how others interpreted what they observed. Her behavior in public reinforced this image. At feasts, she remained composed. Her posture stayed steady, her gestures measured, her voice even. She did not withdraw, and she did not overcompensate. She occupied her place exactly as expected, neither drawing attention nor avoiding it. Consistency created reassurance. Others saw no change in her conduct. If anything, she appeared more controlled, more careful, more aware of her surroundings. This steadiness made it difficult to associate her with any disturbance in the court. While others shifted, she remained unchanged. That contrast became noticeable. A mistress, under the same conditions, might show signs of discomfort, a hesitation before speaking, a forced smile that did not hold, a reaction that seemed slightly too quick or slightly too delayed. These small differences stood out more when placed beside someone who remained completely composed. Observation filled the gap. No one needed to point out the difference. It was seen and interpreted without explanation. The more it was seen, the more it was accepted. The mistress appeared uncertain. The wife appeared stable. Stability carried authority. Without speaking directly, the wife reinforced her position as the reliable center of the household. Others aligned themselves with what felt secure. They moved closer to what appeared consistent and away from what seemed unpredictable. She did not need to guide them. Her role was to remain visible, unchanged, and beyond question, the contrast did the rest. This required discipline. Any break in her composure could weaken the image she had built. A moment of visible anger, a careless remark, or a direct accusation could connect her to the situation in ways she could not control. Once connected, she would no longer stand apart from what was being discussed. So she remained careful, not only in what she said, but in how she appeared at all times. Her control extended beyond conversation into posture, expression, and timing. Every detail supported the same impression, an impression that did not need explaining, because once it was established, others accepted it without question. And once accepted, it shaped everything that followed. She protected herself not by denying what was happening, but by ensuring she was never seen as part of it, as her calm presence remained unchanged. The contrast around her became more visible without needing a name. In the moment anyone tried to trace the outcome back to its source, there was already nothing clear enough left to hold against her. It did not happen all at once. At first, the idea appeared in separate conversations, spoken quietly and without confidence. One person mentioned it in passing, unsure of its importance. Another recalled hearing something similar, though not the same. These moments seemed isolated, small enough to ignore, easy enough to forget. But they did not disappear. They returned, slightly altered, in different places. A remark made at a table appeared again in a corridor. A question raised in private surfaced later in a larger gathering. Each time, it was repeated. It sounded a little more familiar, a little less uncertain. No one paused to examine it closely. The repetition itself gave it weight. People did not ask where it came from, only whether they had heard it before, and when they recognized it, even faintly, they accepted it more easily. Recognition replaced verification. It was not important whether the idea was true. It was important that it felt known. Familiarity created comfort, and comfort reduced the need for doubt. What was repeated often enough began to sound like something already understood. The court adjusted quietly. Conversations shifted in tone. Certain names were spoken more carefully, sometimes avoided altogether. A hesitation entered speech where none had existed before. These changes were small, but they appeared consistently across different spaces. Consistency created the impression of agreement. No one declared that something was wrong. Yet the same suggestion appeared in multiple voices. Each person believed they were responding to what others had already noticed. This shared assumption made the idea feel stable. It no longer seemed like a rumor. It felt like something that had already been accepted, even if no one had formally accepted it. The absence of a clear origin made it easier to believe. If no one could identify who started it, then it must have come from everywhere. This made it difficult to challenge. To question the idea would require questioning everyone who repeated it. And because no one claimed ownership, there was no single point to confront. Doubt had no clear target. The mistress, surrounded by this quiet shift, felt its effects without understanding its structure. She might hear the same phrase more than once, spoken with slight variation each time. She might notice that certain people avoided speaking directly to her, choosing instead to speak around her. The change was subtle, but it was constant. She could not respond to what was undefined. There was no accusation to deny, no statement to correct, only a shared understanding that something was not as it should be. That understanding did not require clarity. It required repetition. Others reinforced it without intention. They repeated what they believed they had heard, not out of malice, but out of caution. No one wanted to be unaware. No one wanted to be the only person who did not notice what others seemed to recognize. This created pressure, not open pressure, but a quiet expectation. To question the idea was to place oneself outside of what others accepted. To accept it was to remain aligned with the group. Most chose alignment. The husband, hearing the same suggestion from different voices, began to feel its weight. Each repetition seemed independent, yet similar enough to suggest a pattern. He did not hear a single accusation. He heard many small indications. Indications were enough. They did not force him to act, but they made him reconsider. They introduced hesitation where there had once been certainty. That hesitation changed how he observed, how he listened, how he responded. The court followed. Once hesitation appeared in someone of his position, others adjusted accordingly. The shared idea, once uncertain, now seemed confirmed through behavior rather than words. The original voice was no longer needed. What had begun as a quiet suggestion had become a collective understanding. It no longer required reinforcement. It continued on its own, supported by repetition and maintained through silence. No one could point to the beginning. No one could define the exact meaning. Yet no one could ignore it. What began as a quiet suggestion became something the entire court repeated without knowing where it started. As the same idea appeared in different voices, it no longer felt uncertain, only incomplete in a way that invited belief. In the moment, everyone accepted that something was wrong. It no longer mattered whether it had ever been proven. Moral concern did not need to be stated clearly to influence how people judged one another. In the Tudor court, reputation was tied not only to behaviour, but to what behaviour suggested. A single action could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on who observed it and how it was discussed afterward. This made the implication more powerful than the accusation. A suggestion could move further when it touched something already feared. Loyalty, ambition, and the well-being of children were not private matters. They were tied to the stability of households and the order of the court itself. Anything that seemed to threaten these ideas drew attention quickly, even if it was never fully explained. The suggestion of disloyalty carried particular weight. It did not need to be proven. It only needed to be considered. A moment of distance, a delayed response, or a shift in tone could be interpreted as a lack of devotion. Once this interpretation appeared, it was repeated with caution, often framed as concern rather than certainty. People did not say someone was disloyal. They wondered if something had changed. They questioned whether attention had been placed elsewhere. These questions did not accuse directly, but they guided thought in a specific direction. Over time, the direction became fixed. The more often the idea of disloyalty appeared, the more natural it seemed. It did not need confirmation. It needed repetition. Once repeated, it shaped how every action was interpreted afterward. Ambition, when mentioned carefully, worked similarly. In the court, ambition was expected, but only within limits. To appear too eager, too visible, or too influential could raise concern. It suggested a desire to move beyond one's place, and that suggestion created unease. Again, this did not need to be stated directly. A remark about someone's increasing presence, or the attention they were receiving, could be enough. It did not need to accuse them of seeking power. It only needed to highlight that others had begun to notice. Noticing was enough. Once people believed something had been noticed, they began to observe it themselves. Each new observation reinforced the previous one, even if it was interpreted differently. Over time, the idea of excessive ambition became attached to the person being discussed. This attachment did not require evidence. It relied on repetition and association. The more often a person was mentioned alongside concern, the stronger the connection became. Eventually, the two were no longer separate. The suggestion of harm to children carried a different kind of weight. It moved more carefully, but it moved deeply. Concern for children was not questioned. It was accepted immediately as something important. When this concern was connected, even indirectly, to a person, it altered how others perceived them. No one needed to claim that harm had occurred. It was enough to suggest that something might influence the household in the wrong way. That influence did not need to be defined. It only needed to feel possible. Possibility created caution. People began to consider what might happen, not what had happened. This shift moved attention toward the future, where uncertainty was more difficult to dismiss. A possibility could not be disproven as easily as a fact. This made it effective, because it allowed concern to grow without requiring proof. Each person who considered the possibility added to its presence, even if they did not speak of it openly. The wife remained within the same pattern. She did not present these ideas as accusations. She did not connect them directly to any individual. She allowed them to exist in conversation, where others could attach meaning to them on their own. That distance protected her. It also made the ideas more difficult to challenge. Without a clear source, there was no clear intention. Without a clear intention, there was no direct opposition. The mistress, however, felt the result. She might notice that certain conversations ended when she approached, that certain individuals spoke to her with more care than before, that the ease she once relied on had been replaced with a quiet distance. She could not name the cause, but she could sense the change. That change did not come from a single accusation. It came from multiple suggestions, each touching a different fear, each repeated in different voices. Together, they formed something stronger, not a statement, but a pattern that shaped how others thought, spoke, and responded, even when no one explained why. Moral concern did not need to be accused directly to influence how a person was judged, as suggestions of disloyalty, ambition, and quiet harm began to repeat. They attached themselves without needing proof. Once these ideas felt familiar enough to accept, they no longer required explanation to shape what followed. Religious concern did not need to be declared openly to begin influencing how a person was seen. In the Tudor court, morality was not separate from daily life. It was repeated in sermons, reflected in rituals, and reinforced through constant observation. What appeared to be proper behavior was not only a social expectation, but also a sign of spiritual order. Because of this, even a quiet suggestion of moral uncertainty could carry significant weight. It did not need to sound certain. A remark placed carefully into conversation could suggest that something was not entirely as it should be. It did not need to describe a specific action. It only needed to imply that there might be something unseen, something that required attention. People listened differently when morality was involved. They did not respond as they would to ordinary gossip. They became more cautious, more reflective. A suggestion connected to virtue or sin did not remain light. It settled more deeply, even when it was not fully understood. The idea of a hidden fault was enough. It suggested that something existed beneath the surface, beyond what could be easily observed. This made it more difficult to dismiss. What could not be seen could not be easily disproven. The language remained indirect. No one spoke of guilt directly. Instead, they referred to appearances, to impressions, to small inconsistencies that did not align with what was expected. These observations did not accuse, but they invited consideration. Consideration led to concern. Concern, once repeated, began to feel justified, not because it had been proven, but because it had been acknowledged by more than one person. Each repetition added quiet weight, making the idea more difficult to ignore. The presence of the church reinforced this process. Priests held a position that combined moral authority with social influence. Their words, even when general, were taken seriously. A sermon that spoke of hidden faults, of appearances that concealed truth, or of the dangers of moral neglect, could be interpreted in many ways. Listeners made those interpretations themselves. They connected what they heard in the church to what they had noticed in the court. The message did not need to name anyone. It only needed to align with existing suspicion. This alignment strengthened the idea. What had begun as a quiet suggestion now appeared supported by something larger. It no longer felt like a private concern. It felt like part of a broader moral understanding. The pressure remained indirect. No accusation was made. No formal action was taken. Yet behavior began to change. People spoke more carefully. They observed more closely. They adjusted their interactions based on what they believed might be true. Belief did not require confirmation. It required consistency. Once the same concern appeared in conversation and in moral teaching, it gained a sense of legitimacy, even without evidence. It felt grounded. The wife did not need to involve herself directly. She did not need to speak to priests or guide their words. She only needed to allow the suggestion to exist in a way that could connect naturally with what was already being said. Once that connection formed, it continued without her involvement. This distance protected her position. She remained within the boundaries of respectability. unaffected by the concerns that were beginning to circulate. Because she was not directly connected, she could not be questioned. The mistress, however, felt the change. She might notice that certain conversations took on a different tone, that references to morality appeared more frequently in spaces where they had not before, that individuals who once spoke freely now chose their words more carefully in her presence. She could not respond to what was not stated. There was no accusation to deny, only a growing sense that something about her was being reconsidered. That reconsideration did not need to be explained to have an effect. Over time, the effect deepened. The idea of hidden fault, repeated across different contexts, began to shape how she was seen. It did not need to be visible. It only needed to be possible. Possibility created distance. And distance, once established, rarely reversed itself without effort. Moral concern did not need to be proven to become persuasive, only repeated in ways that aligned with what people already feared. As quiet suggestions began to echo within both conversation and religious expectation, they gained weight without requiring clarity. At the point, these ideas felt familiar enough to accept. They no longer needed to be named to influence what people chose to believe. Political reputation did not collapse because of one decision, but because others began to question how that decision had been made. In the Tudor court, a man's authority depended not only on his position, but on how others judged his judgment. It was not enough to act. He had to be seen as acting correctly, consistently, and with control. Once that perception began to shift, even slightly, everything around him adjusted. The change did not begin with open criticism. It appeared first as hesitation, a pause in conversation when his name was mentioned, a careful choice of words when referring to his decisions. These were not direct challenges. They were small adjustments that suggested something was no longer certain. Others noticed this before he did. Advisors, attendants, and observers listened for signs of instability. They did not need confirmation. They needed only the sense that something might be changing. Once that sense appeared, they began to observe more closely. A suggestion, placed carefully, could guide that observation. It did not need to question his authority directly. It needed only to question the consistency of his judgment. A remark about a recent decision, framed as uncertainty rather than criticism, was enough to introduce doubt. Doubt did not remain isolated. Once introduced, it began to influence how future actions were interpreted. Decisions that might once have been accepted without hesitation were now examined more closely. Each new action was measured against the growing sense of uncertainty. This created a pattern, not a clear one, but a recognizable one. A series of small hesitations, repeated across different conversations, formed the impression that something was not entirely stable. That impression did not require evidence. It required repetition. The suggestion of favoritism deepened this effect. It did not accuse him of wrongdoing. It implied that his attention had shifted, that his decisions might be influenced by personal preference rather than careful consideration. This implication did not need to be stated openly. It appeared through comparison. Others began to notice differences. They observed who received attention, who was included, and who was excluded. These observations, once connected to the idea of favoritism, reinforced the sense that his judgment was no longer balanced. Balance was expected. A man in his position was expected to remain steady, unaffected by personal attachments. When that expectation seemed uncertain, even slightly, it altered how others responded to him. They became cautious, not openly resistant, but more reserved. They listened more than they spoke. They avoided committing themselves fully to his decisions. This caution was not announced. It appeared gradually. In the way conversations shifted, advisors felt this change most clearly. Their role depended on alignment. They needed to anticipate his decisions and support them. But when his judgment seemed less predictable, That alignment became uncertain. They began to consider alternative outcomes, to prepare for changes they could not yet define. Preparation created distance. They did not withdraw completely, but they adjusted their involvement. They spoke more carefully. They observed more closely. They avoided attaching themselves too strongly to any single direction. This distance was subtle, but it was consistent. The more it appeared, the more noticeable it became. Others followed the same pattern, not because they were instructed to, but because it felt safer. The wife did not need to direct this process. She did not speak about his decisions openly. She did not question him in public. She allowed the idea of uncertainty to exist in conversation, where others could interpret it in their own way. That interpretation shaped behavior. Each person adjusted slightly, responding to what they believed others had already noticed. No one acted alone. The shift was collective, built from many small reactions. The husband, surrounded by this quiet change, began to feel it. He might notice that conversations took longer to reach an agreement. The advisors offered suggestions with more caution. That support, once immediate, now came with hesitation. He could not point to a cause. There was no single moment where his authority was challenged, only a gradual change in how others responded to it. That change was enough, because authority depended on confidence, and confidence, once questioned, did not return easily. Political doubt did not begin with opposition, but with small hesitations that repeated until they formed a pattern. As suggestions of uncertainty and favoritism moved through the court, they reshaped how others chose to respond without needing to confront him directly. By the time his judgment felt less certain than before, the structure around him had already begun to shift. Distance did not begin with rejection, but with small changes that were easy to overlook at first. The mistress did not notice it immediately. There was no single moment when everything shifted. Instead, the change appeared in fragments. A familiar face is missing from a gathering, a conversation that ended sooner than expected, a pause where there had once been ease. At first, these details seemed unconnected. People were often absent for many reasons. Conversations were interrupted regularly. Nothing about these changes appeared significant on their own, but over time, they began to repeat in ways that were difficult to ignore. Repetition created a pattern. Friends who had once stood close now appeared less frequently. Their absence was not explained, and it was not addressed. When they did appear, their behavior had changed. They spoke with less familiarity. They remained at a slight distance, both physically and in tone. No one announced this shift. There was no decision made openly. No agreement was stated aloud. Each person adjusted quietly, responding to what they believed others had already begun to do. The change did not require coordination. It spread through observation. Observation replaced instruction. People watched how others behaved and followed that example. If one person hesitated, another did the same. If one person chose distance, it signaled that distance was acceptable, even expected. This made the change feel natural. No one felt responsible for it. Each individual could believe they were simply responding to what they had noticed. Because of this, no one attempted to stop it. The invitations began to change next. They did not stop entirely. They became less certain. A name that had once appeared regularly on guest lists appeared less often. Sometimes it was included, sometimes not. The inconsistency created uncertainty. Uncertainty affected behavior. Without clear expectations, the mistress could not rely on her previous position. She might attend one gathering and feel observed more than welcomed. She might be absent from another without explanation. The pattern was unclear, but the effect was consistent. She began to feel it, not as a clear rejection, but as a gradual withdrawal. Conversations required more effort. Responses became shorter. Moments of silence lasted longer than they had before. The atmosphere changed. Where there had once been warmth, there was now caution. Where there had been familiarity, there was now distance. These changes were subtle, but they accumulated. Eyes revealed what words did not. Glances that once lingered with interest now passed quickly. When they did linger, they carried a different weight. Not curiosity, but evaluation. Not openness, but restraint. No one spoke about this directly. To do so would require acknowledging that something had changed. Instead, the change remained unspoken, visible only through behavior. This made it more difficult to confront. The mistress could not respond to what was not said. She could not ask why invitations had become uncertain. She could not question why conversations had shifted. There was no clear moment to address. Only a series of small changes that together created a new reality. Others adjusted without effort. They did not need to remind themselves to act differently. The change had already settled into their behavior. It became automatic, repeated without thought. This made it stable. Once a pattern of distance formed, it did not require reinforcement. It continued on its own, supported by repetition and accepted through familiarity. The wife did not need to appear in these moments. Her presence was not required for the distance to grow. It expanded through the actions of others, each contributing a small part without recognizing the whole. The result was quiet, but complete. The mistress remained visible, but no longer central. She was present, but not included in the same way. The space around her had changed, even if the setting had not, and that change did not reverse easily. Because once people had adjusted their behavior, returning to what had been before required effort, an effort that few were willing to make without a clear reason. So the distance remained, and over time, it became the new expectation. Distance did not arrive suddenly, but formed through small adjustments that repeated until they became consistent. As others quietly changed how they appeared, spoke, and invited, the space around her shifted without needing explanation. Over time, this pattern settled so deeply that no one paused to consider how it had begun. Only that it now felt natural to maintain. No removal was announced. Yet the result became visible in the way people behaved. The wife did not need to appear at the center of what was happening. Her presence, if anything, remained unchanged. She continued to attend the same gatherings, speak with the same tone, and maintain the same composure that others had already come to expect. Nothing about her suggested action. There were no direct interventions, no visible confrontations, no moments where she seemed to guide what others should do. From a distance, it appeared as though she was simply maintaining her place within the court. Yet around her, the environment had begun to adjust. These adjustments were not ordered. They emerged through repetition. One person chose to stand slightly further away. Another shortened a conversation. A third avoided eye contact altogether. Each action, small on its own, contributed to a larger shift. The court responded without instruction. People observed one another and followed what felt appropriate. If the distance appeared acceptable, it was repeated. If hesitation seemed necessary, it was mirrored. No one needed to explain these choices. They spread naturally. This created the appearance of agreement, not because anyone had declared it, but because similar behaviors appeared across different individuals. Each person believed they were responding independently, yet their actions aligned. Alignment replaced the decision. There was no moment when the court decided to isolate the mistress. Instead, isolation formed gradually, built from repeated choices that felt reasonable at the time. Each person contributed a small part without recognizing the whole. The mistress experienced the result, not the process. She might notice that the rooms felt quieter when she entered. Those conversations shifted direction or ended entirely. That people who once remained close now positioned themselves at a distance that could not be easily explained. No one addressed this directly. There was no explanation offered. No acknowledgement of change. The absence of explanation made it more difficult to confront. Without a clear cause, there was no clear response. She could not challenge what was not stated. Any attempt to question the change would require naming it. And once named, it would require others to respond. But because nothing had been openly declared, no one felt obligated to provide an answer. This maintained the pattern. Silence supported it. Repetition reinforced it. The lack of direct action made it appear natural, even inevitable. Meanwhile, the wife remained separate. She did not need to reinforce the distance. She did not need to monitor its progress. The court carried it forward on its own, guided by shared observation and unspoken understanding. Her role had already been completed. What followed required no further involvement. The structure had been set. The pattern had been established. Others continued it without realizing they were doing so. This made the result stable, because it did not depend on a single action or a single person. It depended on many small actions repeated across time. To reverse, it would require those actions to change. And change requires awareness. Awareness did not appear. The court continued as it always had, adjusting quietly, responding to what felt appropriate. The mistress remained within the same spaces, yet no longer occupied the same position within them. Presence did not guarantee inclusion. She was seen, but not engaged, heard, but not responded to in the same way. The difference was subtle, but consistent. Consistency made it permanent. Once behavior settled into a pattern, it became difficult to alter. People followed what they had become used to. They did not question it, because it no longer felt new. The wife did not need to remove it. The court had already done it. Without instruction, without acknowledgement, without resistance, no action needed to be taken openly for the result to appear complete. As each person adjusted quietly, the court reshaped itself without ever announcing a change. With time, what began as a subtle distance became a condition no one felt responsible for, yet no one chose to undo. Nothing in the court changed as quickly as it first appeared. What seemed sudden from the outside was often the result of something that had been allowed to move slowly, without interruption. A respectable wife understood that influence did not require speed. It required time, repetition, and the absence of interference. She did not rush the process. To act too quickly would draw attention. A sudden shift would invite questions. It would suggest intention, and intention could be traced. Instead, she allowed each change to settle before another began. This created continuity. Each small adjustment appeared connected to what came before it. There was no clear break, no moment that stood apart as the cause. Everything blended into a single progression that felt natural. Patience reduced resistance. When a change occurred gradually, people did not feel the need to oppose it. They adjusted without noticing how much had already shifted. By the time the pattern became clear, it had already been accepted. This acceptance did not require agreement. It required familiarity. The more often a behavior was repeated, the more normal it felt. What once seemed unusual became expected. What was expected no longer needed to be questioned. The wife allowed this to happen. She did not repeat the same suggestion constantly. She did not remind others of what had been said. She trusted that once introduced, the idea would return on its own, carried by those who had already accepted it. Repetition did not need to be forced. It occurred naturally in a court where conversation moved continuously. The same names appeared in different contexts. The same situations were discussed from different angles. Each time, the idea reappeared. Slightly altered but still recognizable, time strengthened it. With each return, the idea felt less like something new and more like something already known. This shift made it easier to accept without examination. People did not question what felt familiar. The pace remained controlled. Too slow, and the idea might fade. Too fast, and it might attract attention. The balance lay in allowing just enough movement to keep it present, without making it obvious. This required observation. The wife watched how others responded. She noticed when the idea appeared in conversation, without her involvement. She recognized when it no longer needed her presence to continue. At that point, she stepped back. Intervening again could disrupt what had already settled. It could introduce a new pattern, one that might not align with what had formed. By remaining still, she allowed the existing pattern to strengthen. Stillness became part of the strategy, not as absence, but as control. Knowing when not to act required the same awareness as knowing when to act. It required confidence that the process would continue without guidance. Others carried it forward. They repeated what they had heard, adjusted what they believed, and responded to what they felt was already understood. Each action reinforced the previous one, creating a structure that no longer depended on its origin. The mistress, within this structure, felt the effect without seeing its development. She experienced the distance, the hesitation, the change in tone, but she could not identify when it began or how it grew. To her, it appeared as something that had already settled. That was the result of time. Not time alone, but time combined with repetition and restraint. The longer the pattern remained unchallenged, the more stable it became. Stability made it difficult to reverse, because reversing it would require effort. It would require people to change behavior they had already accepted. It would require them to question something that felt familiar. Few chose to do that. The wife did not need to ensure the outcome directly. She needed only to allow it to continue long enough for it to become part of the environment. Once it reached that point, it no longer required attention. It maintained itself. Change did not need to be forced when it could be allowed to settle through repetition and time. As each small shift was accepted without resistance, it became part of what others considered normal. With enough time, what once required careful introduction no longer needs support to remain in place. He did not hear it all at once. At first, it appeared in fragments, a remark that paused before finishing, a sentence that changed direction midway, a conversation that felt slightly more careful than before. Nothing in these moments seemed direct, yet something in their tone remained with him longer than expected. He recognized the change before he understood it. People who once spoke freely now chose their words with more attention. They avoided certain details, not because they had been told to, but because it felt necessary. This caution did not accuse him, but it surrounded him. That surrounding created pressure, not the kind that forced a reaction, but the kind that lingered. It made him aware of how he was being observed. It made him listen more closely, even when nothing was clearly said. His reputation became present in a different way. It was no longer something assumed. It became something considered. Each interaction carried a sense that it might reflect more than the moment itself. A decision was no longer just a decision. It was a sign. He began to notice how others responded to him. A suggestion offered with hesitation. Agreement that arrived more slowly than before. A silence that followed where conversation might once have continued. These were not refusals, but they were not the same as before. They suggested uncertainty. Uncertainty did not remain outside him. Over time, it entered his thinking. He began to replay conversations, to consider what had been said and what had not. He began to measure his own actions against the responses he received. This created a shift. Where he had once acted without hesitation, he now paused. Where he had once defended, he now considered. The change was small, but it repeated. Repetition made it visible. Others observed it. They saw the hesitation, even if they did not understand its source. That observation reinforced what they had already begun to believe. The pattern deepened. The idea that something might be wrong did not need confirmation. It needed to be reflected. Each time he hesitated, it confirmed the uncertainty that had already formed around him. His attention turned inward. He did not immediately question the court. He questioned himself. He examined his decisions, his choices, his attachments. He asked whether something had shifted without him noticing. This questioning changed his priorities. Protecting the mistress required certainty. It required confidence in his position and in his judgment. But as that confidence weakened, protection became less immediate. He did not withdraw openly. There was no clear break, no moment where he declared a change. Instead, his responses adjusted. He spoke more carefully. He avoided situations that might draw attention. He allowed distance to appear where closeness had once been. This distance was subtle, but consistent. The mistress felt it, not as rejection, but as hesitation. Conversations that once flowed easily now paused. Gestures that once seemed natural now appeared measured. The difference was not explained, but it was repeated. She could not name the cause. There was no accusation she could respond to, no statement she could correct, only a behavior change that reflected something unspoken. The husband felt the weight of this change. He became aware that his actions were being interpreted beyond their immediate meaning, that each decision might be seen as evidence of something else. This awareness did not guide him. It restrained him. Restraint replaced instinct. Where he might once have acted quickly, he now considered the effect. Where he might once have spoken directly, he now chose silence. Each adjustment reduced the clarity of his position. Clarity had once supported him. Without it, his authority remained. But it no longer felt as stable. Others responded to this instability, even if they did not describe it openly. The court adjusted around him. Advisors became more cautious. Conversations became more controlled. The same pattern that had surrounded the mistress now began to include him. He stood within it, not as its origin, but as its subject. And as he became more aware of how he was seen, he continued to adjust, reinforcing the very pattern that had begun to shape him. The moment he began to hear what others were not saying, his attention shifted from defending to understanding. As hesitation replaced certainty, his own responses started to reflect the doubt that had formed around him. Over time, this quiet adjustment made it difficult to separate what he believed from what he had been led to question. She did not ask for anything in return. The wife understood that pressure, to once made visible, could interrupt what had already begun to take shape. A demand would draw attention. A demand would require a response. And a response, once spoken aloud, could alter the balance that had been forming quietly. So she remained still, not distant, but composed. She continued to appear beside her husband in the same way she always had, without change in posture or tone. She did not refer to what others had begun to suggest. She did not acknowledge the distance that had grown around the mistress. Her silence removed expectation. There was nothing for him to answer, nothing for him to defend against. Without a question, there could be no refusal. Without a demand, there could be no conflict. The absence of pressure allowed him to remain within the situation without being forced to choose. This made his position more difficult. Because the decision was no longer external, it became internal. He was not responding to a request. He was responding to his own awareness of what had changed. The wife did not add to that awareness. She did not repeat what had been said. She did not guide his attention. She allowed the uncertainty that had already formed to remain undisturbed. That uncertainty continued to influence him, even without her involvement. This required restraint. It meant accepting that the process could not be rushed. It meant allowing him to move at his own pace, even if that pace seemed slow. Any attempt to accelerate it would risk breaking what had already settled. She maintained her role carefully. Her behavior did not shift to reflect the change around her. She remained consistent in public and in private. She spoke to him as she always had, neither colder nor warmer. This consistency removed any sense of confrontation. He noticed this, not immediately, but over time, he became aware that she was not reacting in the way he might have expected. There was no visible disappointment, no attempt to draw attention to what had been happening. This absence created contrast. Where others had begun to hesitate, she remained steady. Where conversations had become uncertain, her presence did not change. This difference became more noticeable the longer it continued. He began to compare, not consciously at first, but as his own uncertainty grew. He looked for stability. He found it in what remained unchanged. That stability did not require explanation. It existed through repetition. The mistress, by contrast, could not maintain the same position. Her behavior reflected the pressure she felt, even if she tried to remain composed. Small changes appeared. A pause before speaking. A response that seemed slightly too careful. A gesture that no longer felt natural. These details were noticed, not because they were dramatic, but because they differed from what had been seen before. In a court built on observation, differences attracted attention. Attention reinforced uncertainty. The more he noticed these differences, the more he reconsidered his position, not through a single decision, but through repeated moments of reflection. The wife did not guide this reflection. She allowed it to develop without interruption. Her role was not to direct him, but to provide a point of stability that he could return to. Return did not need to be declared. It appeared in small adjustments. A conversation that lasted longer than before. A gesture that no longer carried hesitation. A presence that felt less divided. These changes did not happen suddenly. They formed gradually, shaped by the same process that had created distance. Each moment added to the next, creating a pattern that became easier to follow. The absence of pressure made this possible. Without expectation, he did not feel forced. Without force, he did not resist. His movement was not a reaction. It was a response to what he had already begun to understand. The wife remained within the same pattern. She did not acknowledge the shift as it happened. She did not claim it as an outcome. She allowed it to appear as something natural, something that did not require explanation. This preserved her position, because she remained outside the visible process. She could not be connected to its result. Her role remained unchanged, even as everything around her adjusted. And in that stillness, the direction had already been set. Her strength did not come from asking, but from allowing the situation to resolve without interference. As he began to respond to his own uncertainty, his actions moved without needing to be guided. Over time, what felt like a choice became something he followed without recognizing when it had already begun. When a rumor grew beyond quiet conversation, it no longer moved unnoticed. It began to appear in places where it had not before. It entered larger gatherings, crossed between different groups, and carried a tone that was less uncertain than it had been at the beginning. What had once been a suggestion started to feel closer to an assumption. This change required adjustment. Left unchecked, the rumor could draw attention in ways that were difficult to control. It could invite questions that demanded answers. It could create a situation where silence was no longer enough to maintain distance. The wife did not respond with force. A strong denial would give the rumor a fixed shape. It would turn something unclear into something defined. Once defined, it could be examined, discussed, and possibly confirmed or denied in ways that could not be controlled. Instead, her response remained measured. She acknowledged nothing directly. When the subject appeared, she answered lightly, as if there was little to address. Her tone suggested that the concern was exaggerated, not false, but misunderstood. This distinction mattered. To deny something completely would invite contradiction. To soften it allowed others to reconsider without feeling challenged. It gave them a way to step back without losing their position. The explanation remained simple. A misunderstanding, a misinterpretation, a moment taken out of context. These possibilities did not need to be proven. They needed only to exist alongside the rumor, offering an alternative that felt reasonable. Reasonableness reduced tension. People preferred explanations that did not require confrontation. A misunderstanding could be accepted without conflict. It allowed conversations to continue without forcing a conclusion. This slowed the spread, not by stopping it, but by changing its direction. The rumor no longer moved in a single line. It was divided, with some repeating the original suggestion and others repeating the idea that it had been misread. Division weakened certainty. Without a single version to follow, people became less confident in repeating it. They spoke more carefully, adding hesitation where there had once been assurance. This hesitation reduced the pressure that had been building. The wife remained consistent. Her behavior did not change in response to the rumor's growth. She continued to appear composed, to speak with the same tone, to maintain the same presence. This consistency reinforced the idea that nothing had shifted in a meaningful way. Stability reassured others. In a moment where attention had increased, her calm suggested that there was no need for concern. People adjusted their reactions accordingly, matching the steadiness she displayed. The image of the household remained intact. There was no visible conflict, no sign of disruption. Public appearances continued without change. Conversations remained controlled. The structure that others expected to see was preserved. This limited further escalation. Without visible evidence of disorder, the rumor lacked something to attach itself to. It remained present, but it no longer expanded with the same force. The mistress felt the difference. The pressure that had once been directed toward her began to shift, not removed, but softened. The focus was no longer as concentrated. The uncertainty remained, but it was less immediate. She could not rely on this shift, because it did not resolve the situation. It only changed its intensity. The distance around her remained, even if the attention had lessened. The wife did not attempt to erase what had happened. Erasure would require confrontation. It would require naming what had already spread. Instead, she allowed the rumor to lose clarity over time, becoming less defined and therefore less forceful. This required patience. The process could not be rushed. It depended on repetition, on consistency, on allowing the alternative explanation to settle in the same way the original idea had. Over time, the rumor changed, not disappearing, but losing its sharpness. It remained in memory, but it no longer directed behavior in the same way. It became something that had been considered, rather than something that needed to be acted upon. The wife remained separate from both versions. She was not the source of the rumor, and she was not the source of its explanation. Her role stayed outside of both, allowing her position to remain stable regardless of which version others chose to accept. This distance protected the outcome, because it ensured that no matter how the situation developed, her image remained unchanged. And that image was what others continued to follow. A rumor that grew too visible required not force, but careful adjustment to prevent it from becoming fixed. As softer explanations appeared alongside it, certainty weakened, and attention began to divide. In time, what once seemed urgent no longer held the same clarity, yet its effects had already shaped what remained. She did not hear a final word. There was no moment when someone told her directly that her place had changed. No one asked her to leave. No one explained what had happened. Yet the absence of words did not make the change any less clear. It appeared through what was no longer there. Conversations that once included her moved on without pause. Faces that once turned toward her now turned away more quickly. The space around her, once filled with quiet attention, began to feel empty in a way that could not be mistaken. At first, she waited, She expected the pattern to correct itself. A missed invitation could be explained. A shortened conversation could be dismissed. A distant glance could be ignored. Each moment alone still allowed for uncertainty. But the moments did not remain separate. They repeated. And with each repetition, they became harder to dismiss. The absence was no longer occasional. It became consistent, appearing in different places, at different times, across different people. Consistency removed doubt. What could once be explained as a coincidence now formed a pattern that did not require explanation. She began to understand that something had shifted. Even if she could not name the exact moment when it began, no one confirmed it. That was what made it more difficult. Without confirmation, there was nothing to respond to. She could not defend herself against what had not been stated. She could not ask for clarity without revealing uncertainty. Uncertainty isolated her further, because to ask would draw attention to what others had chosen not to speak of. And in a court where silence carried meaning, breaking that silence carried risk. So she remained within it. She continued to appear where she had always appeared. She spoke when spoken to. She held herself in the same way she had before. But the response she received no longer matched what she offered. Responses became shorter, not abrupt, but reduced. Enough to signal distance without creating confrontation. Enough to be noticed without being addressed. Distance became visible, not through movement, but through absence. The absence of ease. The absence of familiarity. The absence of unguarded conversation. These absences defined her position more clearly than any statement could. She began to observe more closely, noticing who avoided her, noticing who remained silent when she approached, noticing who continued as before, and how few those individuals had become. The number mattered, because it showed that the change was not limited to one person or one group. It had spread quietly, without coordination, until it became something shared. Shared behavior did not need explanation. It felt natural to those within it. It felt expected. And because it felt expected, no one questioned it openly. She felt it fully, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual removal. Each moment took something small. Each absence created a space that was not filled again. Those spaces accumulated. They formed a new environment, one where she was present but no longer central, visible but no longer included in the same way. Inclusion had shifted, and once shifted, it did not return on its own. She could not identify a single cause. There was no event to point to, no conversation to recall as the beginning, only a series of moments that had led to where she now stood. That lack of clarity made it final, because what could not be traced could not be reversed easily. There was no point to return to, no place to begin again. Others continued as before. The court remained active. Conversations continued. Gatherings took place without interruption. Nothing in the structure had changed, only her position within it. And that position had become clear without ever being spoken. Nothing needed to be said for her to understand that the space around her had already changed. As each absence repeated across different moments, it formed a pattern that no longer required confirmation. When no one remained beside her, the silence itself became the only answer she was left with. The change did not end when the conversations became quiet. What had settled around her did not disappear with time. It remained, not as something constantly spoken about, but as something remembered. The absence of attention did not restore her position. It confirmed that the shift had already taken place. Reputation did not return to its previous form. Once it had been adjusted, even slightly, it carried that adjustment forward. People did not need to repeat what had been said before. They recalled it when necessary, often without realizing they were doing so. This recall shaped future decisions. When her name appeared in conversation, it no longer carried the same weight. It did not invite the same interest. It did not produce the same response. There was hesitation where there had once been ease. Hesitation affected the opportunity. Proposals that might once have been considered did not appear in the same way. Conversations that might have led to arrangements remained brief or did not begin at all. The possibility of a future connection depended on how she was seen, and that perception had already changed. No one stated this openly. There was no moment when she was told that her prospects had diminished. The change appeared through absence. Invitations did not arrive. Discussions did not continue. Consideration did not extend beyond a certain point. Absence defined the outcome. What was not offered revealed more than what was. Each missed opportunity reinforced the idea that something had shifted beyond recovery. The pattern did not need explanation. It was repeated often enough to be understood. Marriage, once possible, became uncertain, not impossible, but less likely. Those who might have considered her position now considered other factors. Reputation, once questioned, did not carry the same assurance. It introduced doubt into decisions that relied on stability. Doubt reduced commitment. People preferred certainty when making long-term choices. Without it, they hesitated. That hesitation limited her options. Not through rejection, but through inaction. Inaction became consistent. Over time, it formed a pattern that was difficult to change. Each missed opportunity led to another. Each absence of response made the next absence more likely. Her position in the court changed as well. She remained present, but not central. Conversations moved around her rather than toward her. Attention settled elsewhere, drawn to those whose reputations remained stable. Centrality shifted. It did not require removal. It required redirection. Others occupied the space she had once held. Not through effort, but through acceptance. The court adjusted to what felt secure. Security guided attention. People aligned themselves with what appeared stable, not with what had been questioned. This alignment did not need to be explained. It followed the same pattern that had created distance. She could observe it clearly. Who was spoken to first? Who remained surrounded? Who was included without effort? These details showed where attention had moved. Attention did not return easily. Once redirected, it continued along the same path. Changing it would require a new pattern, one strong enough to replace what had already settled. No such pattern appeared. The absence remained, and within that absence, her position became defined. She was no longer at the center of anything that shaped the court. She was not excluded entirely, but she was no longer part of what mattered most. This distinction carried weight, because being present without influence was not the same as being absent. It meant seeing what had changed without being able to alter it. Others did not need to act against her. They only needed to continue as they had begun. Their behavior, repeated over time, maintained the distance without effort. The wife did not need to reinforce it. The structure had already formed. It continued on its own, supported by memory and repetition. Nothing needed to be said. The outcome remained visible, and it remained consistent. Reputation did not need to be discussed to continue shaping what followed. As absence replaced opportunity, each missed moment reinforced the position she could no longer return from. In the space where she once stood at the center, something else had already settled into place. Nothing needed to be announced for the outcome to be understood. From the outside, the marriage appeared unchanged. The same appearances were maintained. The same positions held. The same routines repeated without interruption. There was no visible sign of conflict. No public acknowledgement of what had shifted. Continuity defined the result. The wife remained beside her husband in the same way she always had. She attended gatherings, fulfilled expectations, and presented herself with the same composure that others had come to recognize. There was no moment where she claimed anything as a victory. Claiming it would have drawn attention. Attention would have required explanation. Explanation would have connected her to what had already taken place. By remaining within the boundaries of expected behavior, she avoided that connection entirely. Her position did not need to change. It remained stable, and that stability reinforced the idea that nothing had been disrupted. Others observed this and adjusted their understanding accordingly. If the structure of the marriage remained intact, then it must not have been threatened. This perception protected the family. Reputation extended beyond individuals. It belonged to the household, to the name, to the connections that depended on its stability. Any sign of disorder could affect more than those directly involved. There was no sign. The absence of visible conflict allowed others to maintain confidence in what they saw. Conversations did not need to address the situation. There was nothing to confirm, nothing to deny. Silence supported this. Not an empty silence, but a controlled one. It prevented unnecessary attention. It allowed the situation to settle without being defined publicly. The husband's behavior aligned with this image. He continued to appear as expected. His actions did not contradict the structure around him, even if his internal position had shifted. It was not expressed in a way that altered the outward form. Form mattered. In the Tudor court, appearance often carried more weight than private reality. What was seen defined what was accepted. As long as the appearance remained stable, the underlying changes did not need to be acknowledged. Others followed this pattern. They did not question what appeared intact. They did not revisit what had already settled. Their attention moved toward what remained consistent, rather than what had been uncertain. Consistency became confirmation. The longer the situation remained unchanged in public, the more it was accepted as resolved. No one needed to revisit the past. The present was enough. The wife maintained her role within this structure. She did not alter her behavior to reflect what had occurred. She did not withdraw, and she did not emphasize her presence. She continued as before, allowing the stability of her position to speak for itself. This stability carried meaning. It suggested control without requiring demonstration. It suggested a resolution without requiring an explanation. It suggested that nothing had been lost, even though something had clearly changed. The mistress no longer occupied the same space. Her absence from the center reinforced the appearance of order. The court adjusted around this absence without needing to acknowledge it. Adjustment replaced conflict. No confrontation had taken place. No public decision had been made. Yet the result was clear to those who observed closely. Clarity did not require a declaration. It appeared through repetition, through consistency, through the absence of disruption. The court accepted what it saw, and what it saw remained unchanged. This was the outcome, not marked by a single event, but by the continuation of what had always been expected to remain. The wife did not need recognition. Her position did not depend on acknowledgement. It depended on stability, and that stability had been preserved. Nothing more was required. The outcome did not need to be declared, only maintained through what others continued to see. As the structure of the marriage remained unchanged, it confirmed a resolution that no one needed to explain. In the absence of conflict, the result settled quietly into place, leaving no moment that could be questioned. Nothing that had been set in motion disappeared without leaving something behind. The structure of the household remained intact. The appearances held steady. The conversations returned to their usual rhythm. Yet beneath that surface, something had shifted in a way that could not be restored completely. Trust did not return in the same form. It had not been broken in a single moment, and it did not collapse entirely. It changed gradually, shaped by the same quiet process that had altered everything else. What had once been assumed no longer felt certain. This uncertainty settled between people. The husband no longer listened in the same way. Even when nothing was said, he measured tone, timing, and hesitation. He paid attention to what might be implied, not just what was spoken. This attention did not bring clarity. It created distance. Distance entered the household, not openly, not in a way that could be named, but in the space between words. Conversations became more careful. Responses became more controlled. The ease that once existed did not return without effort. The wife maintained her composure. She did not acknowledge this change. She did not alter her behavior to address it. Her consistency remained. But consistency no longer meant the same thing. What had once felt stable now carried a different weight. Stability had been preserved, but the meaning of that stability had changed. It no longer represented ease. It represented control. Others within the court felt this shift as well. The pattern of quiet suggestion had not remained limited to a single situation. It had been observed, repeated, and understood. People became more aware of how easily perception could change. This awareness altered behavior. Conversations grew more guarded. Words were chosen with greater care. Even casual remarks carried hesitation, as if they might be repeated elsewhere in ways that could not be predicted. Caution became common, not because of a specific threat, but because of what had been demonstrated. The court had seen how influence could move without being named. That understanding remained. It affected everyone, not only those directly involved, but also those who observed from a distance. They adjusted their speech, their tone, their presence. They avoided unnecessary attention. They avoided anything that might be interpreted beyond its intention. Interpretation had become unpredictable. What one person said could be understood in different ways by different listeners. This uncertainty made communication less direct. It encouraged restraint, even when none had been necessary before. The environment changed. It did not become silent, but it became measured. Conversations continued, but with an awareness that they could extend beyond the moment in which they were spoken. This awareness spread gradually. Like the original suggestion, it did not require instruction. It moved through observation and repetition. Each person adjusted slightly, and those adjustments formed a new pattern. The pattern resembled caution, not imposed, but accepted. It felt reasonable, even necessary. Yet it created a distance that had not existed before. The wife remained within this environment. Her position had not weakened. Her role had not changed. But she was now part of a structure shaped by the same process she had allowed to unfold. She could not remove it, because it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the court. The mistress had been affected first, but not last. Others carried the awareness forward, applying it to different situations, different people. The process repeated, even without intention. This repetition deepened the effect. The court became a place where perception moved carefully, where suggestion carried weight, and where certainty was less easily assumed. Nothing had been declared, yet everything had adjusted. And those adjustments remained. What had been achieved through quiet influence did not end with a single outcome, but continued to shape how others chose to see and speak. As caution replaced ease, the court carried forward a pattern that no longer needed to be guided. With time, uncertainty settled into something that remained present, even when no one could clearly point to its source. Rumors did not need form to be effective. They did not require proof, structure, or a clear beginning. They moved through the Tudor court in ways that could not be easily followed, carried by voices that did not claim them, shaped by listeners who did not fully understand them. Nothing about them appeared solid. There was no object to hold, no document to examine, no witness to question with certainty. And yet, their effect was visible in every small adjustment that followed. A hesitation, a distance, a change in tone. These became the evidence of something that could not be directly seen. They required no force. No confrontation took place. No demand was made. No authority needed to intervene. The process unfolded without resistance because it did not appear as an action. It appeared as a reaction. Each person believed they were responding to what they had observed, to what they had heard, to what they felt was already understood. This belief allowed the rumor to continue without challenge. There was no blood, no visible conflict, no open removal, no moment that could be named as the turning point. Everything remained within the boundaries of what was considered proper, controlled, and acceptable. This made it more effective, because what remained within those boundaries could not be easily opposed. It did not disrupt the order of the court. It adjusted it. The result did not require recognition. No one needed to declare what had happened. No one needed to confirm it. The change was visible through behavior, through absence, through the quiet redirection of attention. Position shifted, not through force, but through repetition, not through command, but through suggestion. Each small moment contributed to a larger outcome that no single person could claim. The wife did not need to appear in this final stage. Her role had already been fulfilled. She had introduced nothing directly, claimed nothing openly, and remained outside of what had taken place. That distance allowed her to remain unchanged, even as everything around her had adjusted. She did not hold the rumor. The court did. It moved through conversations, through memory, through shared understanding. It existed without needing to be spoken directly, present in the way people chose to act. That presence remained, even when the original situation had passed. The pattern it created continued. People remembered how easily perception could change. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. This was the lasting effect, not the removal of a single person, but the demonstration of a process that required no visible action, yet produced visible results, a process that could be repeated, because it depended not on power alone, but on observation, timing, and restraint, on understanding how people listened, how they interpreted, and how they responded without being told. This understanding did not disappear. It remained within the court, shaping future interactions, influencing decisions that would never be connected to this moment, yet still carried its pattern. The rumor had no form, yet it left structure behind, a structure built from silence, repetition, and the absence of certainty. And within that structure, positions were made and unmade without ever being declared. The court continued. Conversations resumed. Appearances remained. Nothing on the surface suggested what had taken place beneath it. But those who had observed closely understood, not through explanation, but through recognition. They had seen how something without shape could still alter everything, and they would remember it. Now, as the court settles back into its quiet rhythm, and as the echoes of these moments fade into something less distinct, it becomes easier to forget how it all unfolded. The halls grow calmer, the voices softer, the patterns more familiar. What once felt uncertain now feels distant, almost like something that belonged to another time. There is a certain stillness that follows, not the stillness of resolution, but the stillness of something that has already been decided and no longer needs attention. People return to their routines. They speak of other matters. They shift their focus without needing to acknowledge what has already been left behind. And within that stillness, everything appears as it should be. The same faces, the same arrangements, the same order. Nothing seems missing at first glance. Nothing seems out of place. Yet if one were to look more closely, the absence remains, quietly settled into the spaces where something once existed. It is easy, then, to let the mind rest, to follow the same patterns, to accept what is seen, to move through the court without questioning the changes that have already taken hold. The rhythm of it all becomes steady, predictable, almost comforting in its repetition. This is how it continues, not through effort, but through acceptance, not through force, but through habit, The same quiet process that shaped these events allows them to remain, without needing to be revisited. And as the night deepens, and the voices grow fewer, and the last movements fade into silence, there is nothing left that requires attention. Only the memory of how easily things can shift, and how quietly those shifts can remain. Thank you for staying with this story, for following each small change as it unfolded, and for noticing what was never fully spoken. May your thoughts slow, your breathing settle, and your mind drift gently away from these halls. Good night, and rest well. A rumor did not need form to shape an outcome, only timing, repetition, and the absence of resistance. As it moved quietly through the court, it reshaped positions without ever needing to be seen. With time, what had no visible shape proved strong enough to decide what remained and what quietly disappeared.